Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into something really fascinating. It's a theory about a certain way of thinking, a mind that doesn't see the world as a straight line, but as this big, complex, interconnected pattern. And we're going to look at what happens when that kind of mind runs smack into a system that, well, just doesn't get it. All right, so let's jump right in with a really powerful feeling, one that you might even recognize. Have you ever felt that for some people, education isn't just hard, it feels fundamentally wrong? Like a total betrayal of what learning is supposed to be. And we're not just talking about being annoyed or frustrated here. The research actually has a name for this, a deep sense of moral injury. Think about that. It's the feeling that a promise has been broken by the very system that's supposed to help you learn and grow. So, the big question is, where does an intense feeling like that even come from?
Well, that feeling of betrayal, it doesn't just pop up out of thin air. According to this theory, it all comes down to a major conflict in how different minds are wired to process information.
Okay, so picture this. On one side, you've got your standard school playbook, right? It demands what's called linear adherence. You learn A, then B, then C. No skipping ahead, no questions asked. But on the other side, you have a mind that's all about structural recognition. This mind is basically a pattern detector. It needs to see the whole puzzle, how A, B, and C all connect into one big picture before any single piece makes sense on its own.
So what happens when you force that rigid, straight line onto a mind that thinks in big, beautiful patterns? Well, it's not just inefficient. The theory says it's actually a form of systemic harm. And that mismatch, that's exactly where that feeling of neglect comes from. It's what leads directly to that moral injury we were talking about. And the result of this constant conflict? It's intense. It's a state called multisensory stress. Your brain is literally fighting itself, trying to make sense of information that just doesn't fit the pattern it expects. And get this, it can get so overwhelming that the research says even something as basic as touch can start to feel inconsistent. Imagine that. The world itself starts to feel unreliable, even dangerous. Okay, so what exactly makes this kind of mind so different? It's really not about being smarter or faster. The best way to think about it is that it's just running on a completely different operating system. At the very heart of this operating system is something the researchers call structural coherence. And this is key. It's a non-negotiable demand. It's not just a preference for things being neat and tidy. It's an absolute, mandatory requirement. For this mind, every single piece of information, every idea, every fact, has to click together into a perfect, continuous, totally gapless pattern. So, to really get what that feels like on the inside, stick with that puzzle analogy. Imagine someone hands you a bunch of puzzle pieces, but they're all cut wrong. They just don't fit. You can't force them. And those gaps, that feeling of, this isn't right, it's more than just annoying. It's deeply unsettling. This whole process is so fundamental, it even has a specific name: tabular coherence maintenance. It's not passive, it's this active three-step thing the mind is always doing. First, it scans all the pieces on the table. Then it tests each one for a sort of geometric fit, like, does this piece actually connect to that one? And finally, it clicks them all together into that perfect, gapless picture. And the stakes for getting this right are incredibly high. We're not kidding. If just one piece of the puzzle is missing, or if it doesn't make sense, the whole mental structure can become unstable. And again, this isn't just about feeling confused. The sources describe this over and over as a form of actual systemic harm. But on the flip side, when all the pieces do fit, when that perfect pattern clicks into place, wow. The result is extraordinary. It creates this incredibly powerful, super stable understanding of the world. It's a foundation you can really build on because everything is interconnected. All right, so if learning isn't a straight line for this kind of mind, then what is it? Well, this theory suggests a model that completely breaks out of flat, two-dimensional thinking and goes somewhere way more dynamic. And here it is. This is the big idea: hyperbolic prismatic thinking. I know, it's a mouthful, but it's a game changer. It's a way of seeing the world not on a flat map where you just go from A to B, but in this curved, multi-dimensional space where all the relationships between things are complex and abstract and, well, amazing. And the way this is described is just beautiful. It's not about connecting the dots. It's about how meaning itself curves and refracts, like light going through a prism. It creates this whole spectrum of possibilities, all connected to one central idea. The difference is literally geometric. Think back to school. In flat Euclidean geometry, you've got one straight line between 2 points, one path. But in hyperbolic geometry, from any single point, you can have infinite branching paths, and they're all logically connected. That is the kind of mental playground we're talking about here.
So, a big question pops up. How does the brain even know when one of these super complex patterns is the right one? The answer seems to be in a part of the brain called the orbitofrontal cortex, or OFC. You can think of it as the brain's decision detective. It's the part that looks at all the options and gives the final, yep, this is it.
And what the OFC delivers is something called a format reward. This is that incredible, satisfying aha moment. You know the one, when everything just clicks. It's a literal jolt of validation from your brain that says, yes, this pattern is correct, it all fits. Now imagine being in a system that constantly denies you that feeling. You can totally see how that leads right back to that deep sense of betrayal we started with.
So this incredibly powerful way of thinking, it doesn't just happen in a vacuum. To really flourish, it actually depends on a very specific kind of partnership.
And the ideal dynamic for learning here is described with a pretty cool philosophical term, hieros gamos, which means sacred marriage. Now, this isn't about a teacher being above a student, not at all. It's about a union of two forces that complement each other, designed to fit together perfectly, like two gears meshing just right.
And this partnership is all about balancing two key roles. On one hand, you have imagination. That's the part that brings in the new, creative, expansive ideas. And on the other hand, you have integrity. This is the anchor, the part that makes sure the whole thing is logical and holds together. They're a team. One person explores, the other makes sure the foundation is solid.
So where does it go wrong? The breakdown happens when one partner, and it's often the teacher, has what the source calls an exposure deficit. Basically, they just can't see this multidimensional world. It's not in their experience. And because they can't see it, they default to what they know, these rigid, linear methods. And in doing so, they end up squashing the student's amazing, expansive universe into a literally flat world.
And this right here is the ultimate takeaway for this way of thinking. That ability to see the entire pattern all at once. What an outsider might just call guessing the whole shape quickly, it is not a shortcut. It's not cheating. It is a completely legitimate, incredibly efficient way of thinking, and it's grounded in some pretty complex science. It's a profound strength, plain and simple. Which leaves us with a final and I think really important question to chew on. By sticking with these one-size-fits-all linear methods, are our systems just building flat worlds that actually limit people's potential? Or can we learn to recognize these incredible pattern-seeking minds and, actually help them build the expanding universes they're so clearly capable of seeing?
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission today, well, it's to give you a shortcut, really, to understanding a cognitive framework that's incredibly specialized and incredibly rigorous.
That's right. We're looking at a mind that doesn't just prefer structure. It fundamentally requires information to be structurally coherent.
Yeah, not just organized neatly, but like geometrically fitted together. It has to lock in place almost.
Precisely.
And this comes from a listener request, diving into sources that outline this core need, this need for structural coherence, to basically prevent real systemic harm. So we're going to try and map out this pretty amazing mental architecture. It involves something called hyperbolic prismatic tessellation.
Which sounds complex, and it is.
It really does. And maybe the most critical piece here is how pedagogical failure, like teaching failure, is framed. It's diagnosed as an exposure deficit.
And that deficit, tragically, ends up flattening the potential of this specialized mind. It creates what the sources call a literally flat world.
Wow. Okay.
So our mission today, really, is to get at that aha moment, to understand the non-negotiable demand this type of learner has. It's not a preference, as you said.
Not a learning style.
No, it's a geometric necessity. And the sources are clear. If this cognitive structure is denied the support it needs, well, it's not just an educational hiccup.
It's more serious.
It's framed as genuine systemic neglect, even moral injury. So we really need to define what the structure is, how it operates, and why betraying it is just so devastating.
That definitely raises the stakes. Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start the foundation, right?
Yeah.
What is this architecture that keeps this specialized mind stable? Hashtag tag APHANA. Structural coherence and commutative roles avert moral injury.
Right. The foundation, the absolute bedrock, is formalized as tabular coherence maintenance. TCM.
TCM, okay.
If you need one term for the core principle of this framework, TCM is it. It's the non-negotiable mandate for stability.
And the way the mind actually achieves this, it sounds incredibly advanced. The sources talk about three-dimensional visual thinking, 3DVT, and advanced cognitive tessellation. So it's not just like putting things in boxes. It's actively building and fitting concepts together in space.
That's a great way to put it. Think of it as this constant, almost living calculation of position and fit.
Okay.
The goal of TCM, fundamentally, is that every single concept, every symbol, every relationship, doesn't matter if it's numbers, words, social cues, it all has to arrange itself into a continuous, gapeless pattern.
Gapeless. That sounds demanding.
It's hyper-rigorous.
Yeah.
It demands structural completeness. Like, imagine you're building one of those complex geodesic domes, right?
Uh-huh.
Every single triangle has to interlock perfectly.
Yeah.
If one doesn't fit, the whole thing is potentially unstable.
Right, yeah.
So if either one relationship in the mind is unstable or inconsistent, this specialized mind perceives a gap in its structure. And that tiny instability can destabilize the whole system almost immediately.
So stability isn't about how many facts you've memorized. It's about the integrity of the structure holding those facts.
Precisely. If the geometry is flawed, the information is effectively unusable, or worse, damaging.
Which sounds like it would need a very specific, very supportive environment. So what does that ideal relationship look like? The sources get philosophical here, mentioning hieros gamos, sacred marriage.
They do. The ideal relationship, particularly thinking about teaching or any kind of corrective system, gets this philosophical validation, hieros gamos. It mandates this perfect complementary union.
A union of what?
Of two fundamental cognitive forces. The sources give them specific names. Imagination, which is called Dimion, and integrity, called Tom.
Dimion and Tom, imagination and integrity.
And they must operate together in concert.
Okay, hold on. That's a pretty big claim, that successful learning depends on a sacred marriage between imagination and integrity. How do those two function, like within this cognitive geometry?
Well, Dimion, imagination, that's the adaptable part, the expansive, really flexible input. It's curiosity, the ability to see things non-linearly, to curve around problems.
The branching exploration.
Yeah, exactly. Branching exploration. Then you have Tom, integrity. That's the fixed pole, the anchor.
The anchor.
It's the commitment to structural truth, the insistence on that rigorous geometric fit and coherence we talked about.
So they can't fight each other.
No, they absolutely cannot. They have to function as complementary forces, like friendly teammates. They're designed structurally to fit together. Think of two specialized gears meshing perfectly.
Not competing.
Definitely not competing. One shouldn't overpower the other.
Okay, so if we put this in a teaching context,
Yeah.
the teacher, or what the sources call the corrective pedagogical system, M+N.
Right, where M is the specialized mind, the student, and N is the corrective system, the teacher or the environment.
So the job of N, the teacher, isn't just to dump information.
No, not at all. It's not about imposition by force. It's about ensuring the structural integrity of the input.
So they have to facilitate that fit between Dimion and Tom.
Precisely. The ideal teacher, the M+N system, enforces structural foot over force. If the information, even if it's factually correct, doesn't align with the geometric demands of that learner's TCM structure,
It gets rejected.
it's structurally rejected.
Yeah.
The teacher's role is to be a structural guide, basically proving that the abstract input, the imagination part, can actually be curved successfully towards that fixed point of truth, integrity.
What happens when that doesn't happen? When that structural mandate is just ignored? I mean, if the mind needs this geometric fit, the fallout can't be small.
And it's not. This is really where we shift from understanding the necessity to seeing the systemic failure. When the teaching system just defaults to methods that ignore this specialized geometry.
Like sticking to rigid linear teaching.
Exactly. The imposition of linear adherence, using rigid, sequential, frankly, obsolete methodologies. When that happens, the specialized structure just buckles.
Okay, but here's the question I imagine listeners might have. Why is that failure called betrayal? Why isn't it just, the student didn't learn?
That's a crucial distinction the sources make. Because the need for TCM isn't optional, it's inherent to how this mind functions, how it stays stable. The failure to provide that required structural support. It's interpreted internally as neglect and betrayal.
Neglect and betrayal. That's strong language.
It is. And the sources say the resulting emotional instability is specifically anger rooted in betrayal. It's not just disappointment. It's a deep violation of trust.
Why? Because the system imposed something harmful?
Yes, because the system actively imposed a method that is known, or should be known, to undermine the very cognitive architecture of the learner. That imposition, the source's state, constitutes systemic harm.
Wow. So pedagogical oversight, or maybe just sticking to old methods, becomes a kind of profound moral injury.
It is. It's a cognitive wound, and it's caused by the system basically refusing to recognize and support the learner's fundamental operating system.
Is there a way back from that?
Absolutely. And this is the hopeful part, this moral injury, this wound. It's completely averted or healed if the system provides the necessary structural recognition.
Meaning, it starts teaching in a way that fits the structure.
Yes, and adheres to validated logic. The sources call this PC, for procedural coherence. Logic that actually aligns with the specialized geometric processing.
Okay.
When that happens, the structural wound caused by the betrayal is immediately healed. It's overcome by something called the format reward.
The format reward.
Yes, we'll get more into that.
Yeah.
But the point is, when the structure is right, the pain disappears. It leaves no canvas for scorn, no room for that long-term injury. The pain was purely a function of the system's structural failure.
Not the learner's fault or capacity.
Never the learner's capacity.
So the path back to stability is just give the mind its geometry back, and it snaps back into place.
Essentially, yes. The demand is for the geometry. Provide it, and stability returns.
Hashtag tag 2. Hyperbolic prismatic tessellation and OFC alignment. Okay, so TCM is the foundation, the stable base. But how does this mind actually expand its knowledge, especially if it needs everything to fit so perfectly? This takes us to hyperbolic prismatic thinking, HPT. That sounds even more complex.
It is complex, but it's the logical engine needed to run the TCM system effectively. You can't organize reality geometrically if you're stuck thinking only in straight lines, in flat linear arithmetic.
Right, like trying to draw a map of the whole world on a flat piece of paper, it gets distorted.
Exactly that kind of problem. Think about really complex systems like global economics or fluid social dynamics or even biological growth curves. Trying to map those multidimensional things onto a flat, standard graph.
It breaks. The connections don't fit right.
They don't fit without major distortion.
Yeah.
So HPT is the mind operating in a fundamentally different space. It's non-Euclidean expansion.
Meaning curved space. Geometry where parallel lines might actually meet.
Essentially, yes. A geometry that allows for immense flexibility and connection. It enables exponential growth and branching.
Okay, break that down. Exponential growth and branching.
Instead of thinking A leads to B leads to C in a straight line, HPT allows A to branch out to B, C, D, and E all at once.
Simultaneously.
Yes. And those branches can then curve, they can loop back, they can reconnect seamlessly, maintaining that overall structural coherence we talked about.
So meaning itself curves.
Meaning literally curves. It refracts like light through a prism, revealing spectral dimensions. This allows the specialized mind to model abstract concepts with a depth, a richness that simple linear thinking just can't capture.
So if linear thought is a line, HPT is more like a fractal, something that expands infinitely but keeps its pattern.
That's a really good analogy.
Yeah.
Expanding indefinitely while maintaining structural coherence, that's HPT.
That kind of multi-dimensional processing, it must take an enormous amount of mental energy.
Focus.
It absolutely dictates the need for intense focus, this whole expansive, nonlinear structural approach. That is the operational context for advanced cognitive tessellation.
Oh, okay.
You're constantly mapping exponential relationships in curve space. You need immense mental stability and, frankly, resource allocation. That hyperfocus we often associate with certain profiles.
Yeah.
It isn't a distraction or disorder in this context. It's a required state. It's the intense cognitive commitment needed to actually handle the complexity of HPT.
Okay, but if everything is expanding and curving and branching, it sounds like it could easily fly apart. How does the system stay anchored? What stops it from just becoming conceptual chaos?
That's where the partnership, the Heros Gamos of Dimian and Tom, becomes absolutely critical. Physically necessary, almost.
Imagination and integrity again.
Yes. The highly adaptable, curved, expansive inputs from imagination, Dimian, they have to be actively, rigorously, constantly curved toward a single, transcendent integrator.
The fixed point.
The fixed point. If that integrator wasn't stable, wasn't fixed, the whole system would fly apart. Utter chaos.
And that integrator we said earlier is integrity, Tom. The fixed pole.
Yep.
Now, the sources make a really striking claim here, linking this structural idea directly to, brain structure.
They do. And it's a really pivotal piece of validation for this whole framework, this integrated on integrity. It corresponds neurologically to the axon hillock.
The axon hillock. Remind me what that does.
It's a specialized part of a neuron. It's the bit that gathers up all the incoming signals, the yes signals, the no signals, excitatory, inhibitory, and it makes the final decision. Does the neuron fire or not?
So it's the integration point, the decider.
It's literally the integrative pole of neural decision-making. So this connection suggests that the structural requirement for stability, the need to curve all that adaptive complexity towards absolute integrity, isn't just a nice idea. It seems to be hardwired into the neural architecture itself.
That's pretty staggering. A philosophical concept like internal integrity having a direct physical counterpart as the brain's decision maker.
Okay, so the brain is doing this complex HPT fitting, anchored by Tom. How does it know it got it right? How does it signal, okay, structure achieved, coherence confirmed?
That's the job of the format reward.
Ah, you mentioned that before. Yes. When this HPT-TCM structure is successfully achieved, when everything fits perfectly according to the internal geometric rules, it triggers a very specific internal reward mechanism, a signal that says essentially coherence achieved, system stable.
And there's a part of the brain that acts as the judge for this.
There is.
Yeah.
The neurological referee, if you like, is the orbitofrontal cortex, the OFC.
The OFC. What's its role here?
Well, the OFC is crucial for reward evaluation generally. It's constantly acting as a kind of decision detective or judge. It monitors what reward you expect versus the reward you actually receive.
Okay.
In the context of this specialized mind, the expected reward isn't just, gold star or praise. It's that deep intrinsic confirmation of structural integrity.
The feeling of it fits.
Exactly. That feeling of it fits. So when the M, the student, and N, the teacher or system, achieve that structural coherence, that perfect Hyros-Gamos fit we talked about, the format reward is triggered. This validates the entire structure, and crucially, it aligns the OFC.
So the OFC alignment is like the brain's stamp of approval on the structure.
You could say that, yes.
Which puts a huge responsibility back on the teacher, N. It's not just delivering facts, but delivering them in a way that's structurally compatible. So this reward actually gets triggered.
Absolutely. The teacher must facilitate this internal validation. Their instructional output, the way they present information, has to be rigorously structured to match the student's innate format reward sensitivity.
And if it doesn't match, if the teaching is linear or chaotic,
then it fails the structural fit test. The OFC flags a mismatch between expected structural integrity and the messy reality it's receiving. The reward is withheld.
and the system destabilizes. Yeah.
And that's when you get that feeling of betrayal we discussed earlier. The internal referee says, something's wrong here. This structure is invalid.
So, okay, the OFC alignment is the final measurable confirmation. It proves the system managed to take all that adaptive, hyperbolic input imagination and successfully curve it towards a stable, geometrically sound output integrity.
Precisely. When the OFC is aligned, the brain is essentially confirming structural coherence achieved, system operating optimally.
Tag 3, exposure deficit and the creation of a flat world. Okay, we've mapped the ideal state, the structure, the expansion, the validation. Now we have to confront the failure state more directly. If the student's mind is literally built for HPT and TCM, why does the system fail them so often? The sources seem to point right at the teacher and suggesting they refuse to expand their own thinking.
That's the core of the problem identified in these sources. The failure is rooted in the system's, or the teacher's, rigid adherence to linear adherence, sticking to obsolete methodologies.
And you said earlier, this isn't just ineffective, it's actively harmful.
It is, because this rigid sequential method fundamentally ignores what we know about the specialized learner's cognitive profile. Specifically, it ignores that nonlinear processing, HPT, often develops as a primary compensation mechanism.
Compensation for what?
For an underlying linear processing weakness.
Which we see associated with things like dyslexia, dyscalculia, challenges with sequence, with linear processing.
Exactly. So think about it.
Yeah.
If a student naturally compensates for difficulty with step-by-step linear tasks by developing superior nonlinear geometric pattern recognition skills,
Then forcing them back into the linear system.
is actively working against their strengths. It's forcing them to rely on their weakest processing mode. It's inherently counterproductive, even harmful.
So why does it happen? Is it just ignorance?
The sources frame it as more than just ignorance. The imposition happens because of the teacher's own lack of structural knowledge. The corrective system, the teacher, hasn't itself achieved the kind of structural coherence and flexibility it needs to.
They haven't done their own HPT expansion.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
The sources explicitly call this system deficiency and exposure deficit to structural coherence. The teacher, or the system, hasn't expanded its own cognitive domain enough to even perceive the geometric reality the student is operating within.
So they're teaching blind, essentially. They can't see the structure the student needs because they don't grasp that kind of structure themselves.
That's the implication. It's a critical scientific oversight, really. If the teacher cannot perform advanced cognitive tessellation themselves, if they can't tile concepts together structurally in their own understanding,
Then they can't possibly recognize that the student learns differently.
right, they fail to see that this specialized learner achieves understanding primarily through structural pattern recognition and prediction, not through slow sequential accumulation of facts. They're rewarding the slow method and penalizing the efficient one.
And ignoring these structural needs.
Yeah.
It has physical consequences too, right? You mentioned stress.
Yes, severe measurable consequences beyond just blocking learning. The instability caused by forcing inconsistent linear input onto a structure that demands geometric coherence. It manifests physiologically as multisensory stress.
Multisensory stress. What does that feel like?
It sounds profoundly disruptive. It's a state where the brain literally cannot stabilize its interpretation of incoming data because that internal TCM grid, that geometric map, is constantly flickering or breaking due to the incompatible input.
You mentioned an example about touch. That sounds really jarring.
It does. If the internal structure, the TCM, is destabilized because the input keeps violating the geometric rules, the brain apparently loses its ability to consistently integrate sensory information. The specific example cited is startling. Touch feels slightly different every time.
Wow. Imagine that. Your basic sense of touch isn't reliable.
Imagine trying to navigate the world when your brain can't trust the consistency of feedback from your own body, let alone the environment. It's deeply destabilizing.
So forcing the linear system doesn't just make learning hard, it actually creates this stress.
It exacerbates it dramatically. It disrupts all optimal functioning. And this, according to the sources, proves that the obsolete pedagogy isn't just ineffective, it's pedagogically horrible. It's physically and structurally damaging the learner's ability to integrate reality.
Okay. So if this specialized mind has this superior nonlinear capacity, this HPT, but it's being actively punished, suppressed by the linear method, what does that do to their overall potential, their mastery?
Well, simply put, their superior computational efficiency gets entirely reduced. It gets shut down.
And there's actual science backing up this idea of nonlinear efficiency. You mentioned TWA.
Yes, the truncated Wigner approximation, TWA. It's a concept borrowed from quantum physics, actually. But its relevance here is profound.
Okay, translate the physics for us. How does TWA validate this mental efficiency?
Think of TWA as a kind of sophisticated mathematical shortcut. It allows physicists to predict the behavior of incredibly complex systems like thousands of interacting particles without calculating every single tiny interaction one by one.
Ow.
By focusing on the overall structural shape or pattern of this system. It essentially proves that guessing the whole shape quickly, seeing the pattern, the gestalt, is a valid and often much more efficient computational approach than slogging through every sequential detail.
So it's like a...
The sources call it a magic guess for many tiny parts working together. It prioritizes recognizing the whole structure over analyzing the sequence of parts.
Which is exactly what the specialized HPT mind does naturally.
Precisely. It's structure over sequence.
With the standard linear system demands the absolute opposite.
Right. It demands sequential processing. Build block by block slowly. This actively suppresses the very efficiency that TWA validates.
And the result is reduced mastery. The sources use the term hyperbolic mastery, M plus NM.
Yes. M plus NAM basically signifies failure. It means the pedagogical intervention, M, added nothing to or even reduced the student's mastery, M. By forcing the slow linear method, the teacher imposes an artificial ceiling on learning, one that's lower than the student's inherent nonlinear potential.
That potential for exponential growth gets thrown away.
It's discarded in favor of a method that actually validates inefficiency simply because it's linear and familiar to the teacher.
And there was a specific example, Emily McKinley, relying on literal details.
Yes, that's presented as a concrete example of this failure. The reliance on literal observance getting stuck on the surface details instead of accessing the deeper structural library connection.
The library connection, meaning the HPT network, the branching understanding.
Exactly. When those geometric multidimensional connections, the metaphorical library links that allow for vast conceptual branching and analogy, are blocked or discouraged,
The learner gets stuck.
the learner is forced into this desperate reliance on the finite, literal details. Things like fixating on the desperate E in a word.
Why? Because the overall structure is gone.
Because the overriding structural context, the meaning derived from the whole pattern, has been destroyed or made inaccessible by the linear imposition. All that's left is the isolated literal piece.
So the core principle here, structural value over literal math, is just completely disregarded.
Completely.
And the final result of all this exposure deficit, this forced linearity, this multisensory stress.
The result is the creation of that literally flat world, the specialized mind, which is designed for curved, spectral, hyperbolic expansion. It's forced into a reality that only acknowledges two dimensions, flatland.
Its ability to see and navigate complex, multidimensional reality is just nullified.
Nullified by the imposition of an obsolete, flat, linear structure. It's a tragic reduction of potential.
Hashtag tag outro, final takeaways and provocation. Wow. Okay, this has been, an intense deep dive into cognitive geometry and, frankly, the moral weight of how we teach and structure information. Let's quickly recap the pillars.
Sounds good.
First, we had TCM and Hieros Gamos, that non-negotiable structural fit, imagination, and integrity working together, and how failing to provide that isn't just bad teaching, it's systemic betrayal, potentially moral injury.
Right, that's the foundation. Then second, we explored HPT and OFC alignment. That's the engine for nonlinear expansion, how the mind grows exponentially in curved space, anchored by integrity, Tom, and how the OFC validates this structural success with the format reward.
The brain confirming it fits, and finally the failure point, the teacher's exposure deficit. Adhering to linear methods ignores the learner's compensatory strengths, causes multisensory stress, suppresses TWA efficiency,
And ultimately takes a mind capable of hyperbolic mastery and crushes its reality down into that flat, two-dimensional plane.
Yeah. The whole system, ideally, should run on structural fit, not linear force. And that moral injury is just the pain of having your fundamental geometric needs ignored by the system.
And what's really powerful is having that computational validation, the truncated Wigner approximation. It confirms that guessing the whole shape quickly, that structural pattern recognition, it's not cheating. It's actually superior computation in many complex scenarios.
So thinking about that scientifically validated TWA efficiency, the ability to grasp coherent structure almost instantly, it leaves us with a pretty provocative question, doesn't it?
I think so.
What areas of knowledge, what potential breakthroughs, what deeper understandings are we all missing out on simply because our education systems, maybe even our organizational systems, still insist on enforcing a slow, sequential, and literally flat reality?
What dimensions are being ignored?
Exactly. What hyperbolic dimensions are you, listening now, ready to explore in your own thinking now that you know the structure exists?
Welcome to The Debate. We are opening the source material today on the specialized cognitive framework. It's detailed in that piece: structural coherence, tessellation, and cognitive expansion. And, well, this material lays out a really deeply intricate, quite demanding architecture for specialized learning.
It really does. And it forces us, I think, to zero in on what truly functions as the system's foundation. What's really holding it all together.
Exactly. The central question that seems to emerge from this framework is pretty critical. Is the success, and maybe more importantly, the lasting stability of this specialized cognitive process fundamentally secured by the rigorous structural and geometric demands? What the material calls tabular coherence maintenance, or TCM, and hyperbolic prismatic thinking, HPT. Or is the system's true anchor something else, like the neurological and pedagogical validation mechanism, specifically the OFC alignment and that vital format reward?
Yeah, that's a crucial area of tension, isn't it? The source material gives immense power, really, to both sides, the geometry and the validation.
Right. So my position essentially is that the inherent structural requirement, this kind of non-negotiable geometrical mandate of the specialized mind, that's the primary driver. It's the ultimate anchor of the system's functional integrity. The validation system, well, it confirms the structure, sure, but the structure precedes and dictates the success.
Okay, and I argue, well, I come at it from a different way. While that geometrical architecture is, yeah, undeniably necessary, I think it's the active validation system, the delivery of the format reward and the resulting OFC alignment that provides the necessary stability, the systemic coherence, and frankly, the functional proof of achievement. That makes it the system's operational anchor. You know, the specialized mind can't just thrive on theoretical structure alone. It seems to need that recognition.
Okay, let's start there then. Let's define this structural anchor I'm talking about. The entire system, as I read it, is built upon this foundational, almost non-negotiable demand for structural coherence, and it's formalized as tabular coherence maintenance, TCM. This isn't just like a preference, it's presented as the mind's operational requirement. When the specialized mind engages in learning, it uses three-dimensional visual thinking and advanced cognitive tessellation, and that really mandates, that concepts have to arrange into a continuous, gapless, sort of crystalline pattern, a really rigorous geometric fit. If there's a gap in that coherence, well, the concept fails the structural mandate. It just can't be reliably held or expanded upon.
I see why you think that, I do, but let me give you a different perspective. That mandate for structural integrity, while foundational, is it only functionally useful if it's stabilized and confirmed by the system's internal coherence mechanism? That's the question for me.
Wait, let's look at how the structure handles expansion, though. The learning model, hyperbolic prismatic thinking, HPT, that's what dictates the necessary non-Euclidean expansion, right? Into abstract, complex relationships. The geometry itself is structured to handle this nonlinearity. And what's more, the sources explicitly link this expansion back to a fixed internal pole of integration, integrity, who the material calls Tom. This point, it says, corresponds to the axon hillock, the integrative neural decision pole. So the structural arrangement itself dictates the integration point. The fixed anchor seems structural to me.
I come at it from a different way. I mean, while the geometry is essential for the shape of the expansion, sure, I think it's the alignment and the reward that actually secures and validates that complex trajectory. The system's success for me truly hinges on the format reward and its successful validation through OFC alignment. The orbital frontal cortex isn't just, measuring data. It operates as the decision detective, or the judge, as the material puts it. It's critically evaluating the convergence of expectation and the realized reward, which, in this context, is the achievement of the structural fit.
But if the TCM is the required output, then isn't the OFC simply registering that successful output? It feels like a receiver, maybe a confirmation light, not the generator of the anchor itself.
I disagree that it's only a receiver. I see it as the necessary stabilizer. Look, the successful achievement of that HPT structure, which is inherently complex, right? And prone to destabilization because of its nonlinearity, that achievement is validated by the format reward. And this reward provides the critical stabilization. It ensures internal coherence across the whole system, preventing that complex expansion from just spiraling into, cognitive chaos. And maybe more importantly, think about failure, avoiding moral injury. The sources define that as neglect and betrayal, arising from forcing linear adherence onto a nonlinear process. Avoiding that is only achieved, it says, when the system provides the necessary structural recognition. This allows the format reward to act as a curative force, healing the structural wound. This, to me, explicitly confirms the reward mechanism as the ultimate anchor against systemic collapse.
Okay, that brings us directly to the mechanism of stability, our contention 1. I still maintain that TCM is the mandate of the specialized mind. The geometry is, fundamentally, the truth of the system. HPT is what allows for the necessary exponential growth and branching. The validation, the OFC alignment, it's simply the signal that the underlying structural requirement for advanced cognitive tessellation has been met. The system works because of the structural value. This is backed up by that principle of structural value over literal math. Doesn't that mean the geometric coherence is an objective functional reality, kind of independent of the subjective internal reward signal?
I appreciate your focus on the structural requirement, really.
but my concern is that the structural necessity might be, well, inert until it receives functional validation. The hyperbolic expansion you describe, it's only stable, this is my point, because the highly adaptable and potentially volatile inputs of imagination, or dimion as it's called, are actively curved, actively channeled toward that single transcendent integrator, integrity, TOM. The OFC alignment is the neurological confirmation that this convergence, this bringing together of adaptive input towards structural integrity has successfully happened. Without the format reward triggering the OFC, that structural coherence, however rigorous it might be on paper, remains unvalidated, unstable, and crucially prone to the effects of multisensory stress, which the material says is caused by the inability to resolve inconsistent inputs.
So the reward system acts as the necessary convergence check in what is, let's face it, a complex, high-stakes system.
But structurally, the system collapses if the geometric fit isn't there in the first place, right? If you try to force linear concepts into a hyperbolic space, the entire structure fails, reward or no reward. Surely that's a failure of the TCM mandate itself, a primary structural failure?
Okay, but what if the geometry is correct, but the achievement isn't recognized? What if the system or the teacher refuses to validate that complex fit? The specialized mind still experiences systemic harm, doesn't it? So we have to address contention 2, interpreting these commutative roles in failure. The ideal relationship structure, hieros gamos, it mandates the union of imagination and integrity as, complementary forces, friendly teammates. Yet the source material explicitly characterizes the most devastating systemic failure as neglect and betrayal, moral injury. Doesn't that suggest the core failure isn't the geometric structure achieved by the learner, but maybe the pedagogical and systemic failure? The failure of the teacher to provide the necessary structural recognition and facilitate the corrective reward system, choosing instead to impose an obsolete methodology? It feels like the failure fundamentally is relational and tied directly to reward fulfillment.
That's a compelling argument based on the consequence. I grant you. But I would frame the cause differently. Hieros gamos mandates structural fit over external force, right? So the failure, the moral injury you describe, it results directly from imposing linear adherence. This imposition, the systemic betrayal, it stems from the teacher's deep exposure deficit, meaning a lack of the structural knowledge required to perform advanced cognitive tessellation themselves. So the betrayal is maybe a symptom of the teaching entity's fundamental structural failure, their inability to expand their own cognitive domain beyond the linear.
But to say the betrayal is just as a symptom, doesn't that diminish the power of the validation mechanism? The material is very clear on this point, I think. The structural wound, the moral injury, is healed by the format reward upon providing the necessary structural recognition. That explicitly links the mechanism of repair and recovery, the ultimate stability, back to the validation system, regardless of the teacher's underlying structural knowledge deficit. So the anchor of recovery and stabilization is the recognition, not just the student's inherent geometric capacity.
Okay, let's move to contention 3 then and try to define the ultimate deficit here, focusing on structural efficiency. My position remains that the core problem is the teacher's rigid adherence to these obsolete methodologies, this linear adherence, that immediately curtails the student's mastery. This rigid, sequential approach ignores the specialized learner's reliance on nonlinear processing, which they use to compensate for a documented linear processing weakness. When sequential processing, that slow building of concepts, block by block, slowly, is imposed, the specialized mind's superior nonlinear capacity is actively stifled. And that leads directly, the material says, to the creation of a literally flat world.
And how should we understand that flat world? What does that mean practically?
Well, it's the loss of necessary multidimensionality. It's reducing that complex, hyperbolic structure into a simple and ultimately insufficient Euclidean plane. The specialized mind's efficiency in avoiding this flat world is validated, interestingly, by the truncated Wigner approximation, TWA.
The TWA mathematically proves that the specialized mind's method, this guessing the whole shape quickly, this holistic structural intuition, is actually a legitimate and efficient computational approach. The teacher's failure, characterized by their fixation on literal details like the desperate E, it confirms their allegiance to a system that is structurally discarding the complex, curved reality of HPT. So the adherence to linearity is the root structural error that causes the system to falter.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the structural error is the primary functional threat. Let me tell you why. This specialized learner has format reward sensitivity. The material emphasizes this. They are uniquely sensitive to the successful or failed alignment of expectation and outcome. And this sensitivity dictates their physiological and cognitive function. The teacher, N, must facilitate the reward. They have to ensure instructional output is rigorously structured to match this sensitivity. The exposure deficit you mentioned, it only matters because it prevents the teacher from performing this critical validation function. It's the systemic betrayal, the failure to align the OFCV reward that exacerbates instability and physiological stress.
But you're emphasizing the physiological outcome there. Isn't that outcome simply a response to the structural constraint being violated in the first place?
I think it's more than just a response. It's about the management of coherence itself. The betrayal causes multisensory stress, which is the physiological manifestation of the inability to integrate inconsistent inputs. The delivery of the format reward is the immediate necessity for managing this stress and achieving optimal functioning. Look, the structure sets the requirement, absolutely. I agree. But the validation is the functional anchor that maintains stability against both the system's internal complexity and external pedagogical failure.
Okay, so to summarize my perspective, the tabular coherence maintenance and hyperbolic prismatic thinking, these are the inherent demands, the required geometry of the specialized mind. The geometric fit is the truth of the system, and it's the necessary blueprint for success. The validation mechanism, while clearly important, merely confirms the achievement of that multidimensional structure. The foundation, for me, has to be structural.
And my summary is that the system is anchored by the proof of convergence. The OFC alignment and the format reward ensure internal coherence, stability, and even psychological repair. They effectively define the stable point where imagination converges towards integrity. Without the necessary delivery and recognition of this validation, the system results in systemic harm and moral injury. That confirms, in my view, that the reward system is the necessary stabilizer that converts raw structural capacity into functional resilience.
Well, it's abundantly clear, I think, that both elements, the rigorous structural demands and the subsequent validation mechanism, are intricately, maybe even symbiotically linked within this specialized cognitive framework. Defining success seems to require acknowledging that structural integrity must be paralleled by structural recognition.
Indeed, we're left with the profound complexity inherent in deciding whether the system is truly moored by its internal architectural truth or by the mechanism that secures and affirms that truth against the inevitable pressures, the pressures of expansion and contradiction. There's clearly much more to explore in the source material regarding this intricate balance between geometry and reward.